A subtle kind of unease begins in the exact moments that are supposed to feel like relief. Nothing is wrong. That is precisely the problem. There is no argument happening, no crisis demanding your attention, no emotional fire to put out, no visible instability in the room, in the relationship, in the day itself. And yet, instead of relaxing into that calm, something in you begins searching. You look for what is off. You wait for the tone to change. You anticipate interruption. You scan for the hidden problem that must be coming. At first, this may seem like ordinary vigilance. Maybe you assume you are just tired. Maybe you tell yourself you have trouble slowing down. Maybe you think you are simply not good at relaxing. But if you observe it closely enough, a deeper pattern begins to appear. Peace itself is making you uneasy, not boredom in the simple sense, not the harmless restlessness of someone who likes activity. Something more psychological than that, a suspicion, as if calm is not trustworthy, as if quiet is only the part of the story that comes before something goes wrong. This often shows up in the most ordinary moments. You finally have an evening with no tension, and instead of settling, your mind becomes more alert. A relationship becomes more stable, and instead of feeling safer, you begin feeling strangely uncertain. Work slows down for a day, and rather than enjoying the pause, you start imagining what you forgot, what you missed, what disaster may be quietly forming out of sight. There is a particular discomfort in these moments that is difficult to explain to anyone who has not felt it. From the outside, everything seems fine, but internally, calm does not register as peace. It registers as a question. What am I missing? What is about to happen? Why does this feel so unnatural? You may notice it most clearly when life becomes quiet after a long stretch of intensity. Perhaps there's been conflict, pressure, instability, emotional unpredictability, overwork, or constant inner tension. Then, suddenly, things ease, the drama subsides. The nervous system should welcome the change. But instead, something strange happens. You do not know what to do with the absence of noise. You may find yourself recreating urgency in small ways, checking messages more often than necessary, mentally revisiting old problems that no longer require attention, starting little arguments in your head, looking for flaws in situations that are, by all reasonable standards, actually okay. This is not because you consciously want chaos. That is what makes the pattern so confusing. Part of you genuinely wants peace. You may even believe you have spent years longing for it. But the moment peace arrives, another part of you begins to resist it. Not dramatically, not with open sabotage. More subtly than that, you become uncomfortable, impatient, emotionally unconvinced. You begin treating calm like an empty waiting room rather than a place you are allowed to inhabit. This can happen in relationships in a very revealing way. If you are used to emotional inconsistency, then a stable connection may initially feel underwhelming, not because it is lacking depth, but because your system has become accustomed to reading intensity as significance. The old rhythm of uncertainty, longing, repair, tension, and relief may have carried so much emotional energy that peace now feels almost unreal by comparison. The same can happen within yourself. If you are used to living with constant inner pressure, overthinking, vigilance, emotional labor, or self-management, then stillness can feel less like restoration and more like a confrontation. Without the familiar noise, something becomes visible. You are left with yourself in a more direct way, and sometimes that directness feels uncomfortable. You may even start questioning the calm. This is where the pattern becomes especially painful. When things are difficult, you tell yourself peace is what you need. But when peace appears, you become suspicious of it. You may think, this can't last. Something must be wrong. I should be doing more. Why do I feel restless when everything is okay? That last question can be one of the most revealing because it points to something deeper than stress. It points to identification. If tension has been your normal state for long enough, then calm is not simply a new experience. It is a disruption of identity. You may not have realized how much of your sense of self was built around coping, anticipating, managing, holding things together, being the one who notices, fixes, prepares, contains, or survives. In that case, peace does not only remove discomfort, it removes a role, and that role may have become more central to your identity than you ever intended. You may begin to see this when there is nothing urgent to solve, without a problem to organize yourself around. You feel slightly untethered, not free, untethered, as if stillness exposes a strange gap in your inner structure. If no one needs anything, if nothing is breaking, if the future is not immediately threatening, then what exactly are you supposed to be doing with yourself? That question can be surprisingly destabilizing, because for many people, peace is not only quiet, it is a mirror. It shows how dependent they become on inner or outer turbulence to generate orientation. This dependence is rarely conscious. In fact, many people would reject it immediately if it were described that way. They do not want chaos. They are tired of chaos. They resent how much of their energy it has consumed. And yet, without it, they feel odd, almost unreal, as if calm lacks the emotional texture required to feel familiar. That familiarity matters more than people realize. What is familiar often feels safer than what is healthy, even when the familiar has caused suffering. This is why a quiet day can make you restless, why a healthy relationship can make you uneasy, why a period of emotional calm can feel strangely empty, not because peace is wrong, because your system may not yet know how to trust it. There is also a hidden grief in this phase. A grief that often goes unnamed, because when peace starts feeling suspicious, you begin to realize how long you may have been shaped by tension, how much of your inner life has been organized around surviving pressure rather than receiving rest, how often your mind has treated stillness not as home, but as vulnerability. That realization can hurt. It can make you see how deeply unrest has entered your identity. How much energy has been spent not only enduring turbulence, but unconsciously depending on it for a sense of continuity. And once you begin noticing this, the discomfort becomes harder to dismiss. You start recognizing that your restlessness is not random. Your suspicion is not irrational in the simple sense. It belongs to a deeper structure, a structure in which peace does not yet feel reliable enough to relax into. You may feel this most intensely in the moments when you try to rest and immediately become self-conscious. You lie down, sit still, pause, breathe, and almost instantly something begins moving inside you. Not true peace. Anxiety about peace. The sense that if you stop, something hidden will catch up with you. An unfinished emotion. A neglected thought. A loss of usefulness. A confrontation with emptiness. Whatever it is, the stillness seems to invite contact with something your usual movement helps you avoid. That is why calm can begin to feel wrong. Not because it is actually wrong, because it exposes how foreign it has become to your system. And once this becomes visible, a deeper question begins to form. Not, why can't I relax, in the ordinary sense, but something more serious. What in me has learned to trust tension more than peace? That is where this journey really begins. Not with relaxation techniques, not with a simple desire to slow down, but with the realization that part of the psyche has started treating calm itself as a threat. And until that is understood, peace will continue feeling less like a gift and more like something your whole system does not quite believe it deserves. To understand why peace can feel suspicious, you have to stop looking at the discomfort as a simple habit. It is not only a habit, it is a psychological arrangement. Carl Jung would never reduce this kind of experience to surface behavior alone. He would look at the deeper structure of the psyche and ask what role tension has come to play inside the personality. That question changes everything, because for many people, tension is not just an unpleasant state. It is a form of organization. It gives shape to awareness. It gives direction to attention. It gives the ego something to do. When life is calm, the ego may suddenly lose the structure around which it has learned to define itself. And once that happens, peace no longer feels like rest. It feels like exposure. Jung understood that the psyche adapts not only to what is good for it, but to what is repeated. Whatever is experienced often enough becomes familiar. And what is familiar, even when painful, begins to feel psychologically trustworthy. This is one of the hardest truths to accept. The psyche often confuses familiarity with safety. If your life has been shaped by instability, emotional unpredictability, pressure, conflict, over-responsibility, or constant internal tension, then calm may not feel natural simply because your system has not organized itself around it. It has organized itself around vigilance. That vigilance becomes more than a response. It becomes identity. You learn who you are through what you must manage, through what you must anticipate, through what you must prevent, through what you must emotionally carry. And over time, the ego begins to derive coherence from that position. This is where the trouble begins. Because when coherence is built around tension, peace feels structurally disruptive. It does not just remove discomfort. It removes the framework that has been holding the personality together. Jung would likely connect this to the way the ego develops through adaptation. The ego is not born fully formed. It takes shape by responding to conditions. It learns what is necessary, what is rewarded, what must be monitored, what must be suppressed, what must be anticipated. If the environment repeatedly teaches the psyche that calm is temporary, that stillness precedes disruption, or that safety is never stable, then the ego learns to remain prepared. Prepared for what? For loss, for conflict, for disappointment, for intrusion, for the sudden shift in emotional climate that makes rest seem naive. In that condition, peace becomes psychologically associated not with trust, but with danger deferred. You are calm now, the system says, but only because you have not yet seen what is coming. This is why some people become more anxious in quiet moments than in chaotic ones. Chaos gives the psyche something recognizable. It activates the old competencies. The ego knows how to function there. It becomes alert, useful, organized, emotionally occupied. It may be exhausted by tension, but it is not disoriented by it. Peace is different. Peace removes the familiar cues. It takes away the urgency. And with urgency gone, the psyche is confronted with something it may have avoided for years, the absence of a role. This is an important Jungian point. The ego often becomes attached not only to suffering, but to the forms of identity built inside suffering. If you have long been the strong one, the calm one, the responsible one, the one who holds everything together, or even simply the one who must always stay ready, then peace threatens more than your nervous system. It threatens a whole configuration of selfhood. If nothing is wrong, then who are you in relation to life? If no one needs managing, if nothing requires constant attention, if the emotional weather is settled, then what becomes of the identity built around coping? That question is rarely conscious. Most people do not say to themselves, I am afraid of peace because it removes my role. But the psyche often behaves as if that were exactly the case. Jung's concept of the persona is helpful here as well. The persona is the social adaptation, the face through which you become legible to the world. Many people develop a persona organized around competence under pressure. They become the reliable one, the enduring one, the one who can function under intensity. This persona may even be admired by others. It can feel strong, mature, necessary. But every persona has a shadow. If your persona is built around control, steadiness, and crisis readiness, then what falls into shadow may be vulnerability, dependence, receptivity, softness, and the capacity to simply be without constant function. That means peace does not only feel unfamiliar. It pulls shadow material toward consciousness. To rest means allowing non-performance. To feel calm means allowing non-vigilance. To trust quiet means giving up some of the identity invested in readiness. And all of this can feel deeply destabilizing. The psyche may then try to restore the old equilibrium by reactivating tension, not because it wants pain in any simple sense, because it wants structure. This is where the mind starts searching for problems in calm periods. It begins scanning, replaying, anticipating, doubting. Jung would likely say that the psyche is compensating for the loss of familiar tension by generating internal substitutes. The outer world has become quieter, so the inner world produces activity to restore a known level of psychic organization. This compensation can take many forms. Mental overactivity, hypervigilance, suspicion of good conditions, sudden impatience, irritation without a clear cause, even the creation of subtle interpersonal tension where none was necessary before. Again, this is not conscious sabotage in the simplistic sense. It is the psyche trying to return to a state it knows how to inhabit. Jung also understood that unresolved inner conflict often becomes easier to hear in silence. When life is noisy, many things remain masked. You can stay busy enough, stimulated enough, externally occupied enough that the deeper contradictions of the psyche remain muted. But peace has a revealing quality. It reduces external distraction, and what if an unresolved internally begins to approach the threshold of awareness? That alone can make peace feel threatening. Not because calm is bad, but because calm leaves less room to avoid yourself. This may be why stillness often produces unexpected discomfort. The moment pressure decreases, sadness surfaces, or emptiness, or a quiet sense of not knowing who you are without urgency, or the realization that much of your movement has been compensatory rather than deeply chosen. Jung would never interpret that as proof that peace is wrong. He would treat it as proof that peace is revealing. And revelation is not always pleasant. This is also where we need to distinguish between peace and deadness, because many people unconsciously confuse them. If your inner system has learned to associate intensity with aliveness, then the absence of intensity can initially feel like emotional flatness. Calm may seem dull, unconvincing, even unreal. The old psyche says, if I do not feel urgency, then nothing important is happening. But that is not necessarily true. It may simply mean that the old measure of significance was built around tension. Jung's broader idea of individuation helps us understand why this matters so much. Individuation asks the ego to move out collective and compensatory patterns into a more conscious relationship with the self. But that transition is disruptive. It often dismantles identities that once felt necessary. It removes investments in old emotional structures. It asks the person to tolerate forms of inner life that are less dramatic but more true. That means peace may initially feel less alive than chaos, even when it is more aligned. Why? Because chaos is charged with old psychic energy. Peace is not yet. The psyche has not fully relocated its trust. It still assumes that tension is where life is happening. So part of the work here is recognizing that your discomfort around calm may have very little to do with peace itself, and much more to do with the old psychological economy that depended on unrest. That economy is powerful. It tells you who you are. It tells you how to orient. It tells you when to matter. Without it, you may briefly feel empty, undefined, or oddly unreal. But from a Jungian perspective, this is not a sign that peace is false. It is a sign that the ego is being asked to reorganize itself beyond its familiar dependence on tension. That is difficult work, because it requires letting go not only of pain, but the hidden identity inside pain. It requires admitting that unrest may have become meaningful to you in ways you never consciously chose. And it requires staying near calm long enough for a new form of inner organization to begin. This is why peace can feel so suspicious. Not because it is dangerous, because it asks the psyche to stop deriving so much of itself from what it has spent years surviving. That is a far deeper challenge than simply learning to relax. It is a confrontation with who you have been when tension was the only thing that made you feel coherent. And until that is understood, calm will continue to feel less like home and more like an environment in which the old self does not quite know how to exist. A different phase begins when you stop treating your discomfort as proof that peace is wrong. That shift matters more than it first appears. Because as long as you assume the unease means something is missing, dangerous, or about to go wrong, you will keep organizing yourself around escape. You will keep reaching for tension, movement, urgency, stimulation, or inner noise in order to restore the state your system still recognizes as normal. But the moment you begin to understand that the discomfort belongs to an old adaptation, the whole experience changes. Not immediately, not in a way that makes peace feel easy overnight, but enough that a new possibility opens. You can begin staying. That is the central movement here. Not achieving calm, not performing calm. Staying inside it long enough for the psyche to discover that it does not have to defend itself against it. This is harder than most people expect, because old forms of psychological organization rarely disappear through insight alone. You can understand perfectly well why peace feels uncomfortable and still find yourself scanning the room, checking your phone, revisiting old problems, or creating internal friction simply because the silence remains too unfamiliar. Jung would not be surprised by this. He knew that consciousness develops gradually. The ego does not simply decide to trust a new inner condition and then comply. It has to live through enough experience to reorganize around it. That means the path forward is not conceptual first. It is experiential. You begin in very small moments. A calm afternoon where nothing urgent is happening. A conversation that remains gentle without turning dramatic. An evening where no one needs anything from you. A stretch of time in which life is not demanding performance, protection, or crisis management. Earlier, these moments might have triggered immediate mental movement, the need to fill the space, to anticipate, to problem solve, to restore emotional texture. Now, the task becomes slightly different. You notice the impulse, and instead of obeying it instantly, you remain present for one moment longer than before. That may sound too small to matter, but psychologically, it matters a great deal, because the old pattern is built on speed. Tension appears absent, and the psyche rushes to recreate it or prepare for it. When you slow that process even slightly, a new relationship begins. You're no longer completely fused with the old reflex. You are observing it, and that observation creates room. At first, the room may feel uncomfortable. In fact, it may feel worse before it feels better. This is something people rarely admit. When you stop generating unnecessary activity, you often come into contact with what the activity was covering. Restlessness, fear, emptiness, old grief, inner disorientation. The question of who you are when you are not needed, not performing, not anticipating trouble. That question can be painful, because if much of your identity was organized around vigilance, then calm creates a kind of identity vacuum. Without a problem to hold, a role to perform, or a threat to monitor, you may feel psychologically unstructured for a while. Jung would see this as part of the ego's reorganization. The old center of gravity is weakening. A new one has not fully formed yet. That is why calm can initially feel not only quiet, but destabilizing. You are being asked to exist without the familiar framework of tension. To many people, this feels like losing something. But over time, if you stay long enough, another experience begins to appear. You realize you are not losing yourself. You are losing a pattern of selfhood built around chronic activation. That difference is everything. Because once you begin to see that, the calm no longer feels like emptiness alone. It starts to feel like an environment in which other parts of you can finally become visible. Parts that were too subtle, too quiet, too unprotected to emerge when your whole system was organized around vigilance. This is where the integration becomes much deeper than learning to relax. You begin discovering what kind of self exists without constant readiness. What kind of thought appears when your mind is not scanning for threats. What kind of feeling emerges when your emotions are not organized around pressure. What kind of desire shows itself when life is no longer reduced to management. These discoveries can be surprisingly humble. You may realize that you do not know what you like when you are not stressed. You may realize that your body has been signaling exhaustion for far longer than your mind ever admitted. You may realize that many of your strongest impulses were not true desires, but attempts to restore familiar activation. This can be disorienting, but it is also clarifying, because for the first time, peace becomes diagnostic. It reveals what tension had been hiding. That is one of Jung's deepest insights in another form. The unconscious often becomes more visible when the outer compensations weaken. When noise subsides, what is unresolved has fewer places to remain concealed. So part of staying inside calm means allowing what rises there to become conscious, not dramatizing it, not fleeing from it, simply letting it be known. Maybe what rises is grief. Then the work is not to recreate busyness. It is to let grief become more real. Maybe what rises is emptiness. Then the work is not to fill it immediately with stimulation. It is to ask what life has been structured around, such that without pressure you feel internally blank. Maybe what rises is guilt. Then the question becomes, what part of you still believes usefulness is the price of existence? These are not small discoveries. They are the beginnings of a new relationship to yourself. Jung's path of individuation always involves this kind of confrontation. The old adaptations that once made life possible eventually become too narrow. They must be seen, not only understood in theory, but lived beyond. That means peace cannot simply be added on top of a tension-based identity. The identity itself has to change. And identity changes slowly, through repetition, through many moments in which you remain in the unfamiliar without fleeing back into familiar. You may notice this in relationships. If a connection remains stable for several weeks without emotional upheaval, perhaps your old tendency was to start questioning it, testing it, withdrawing from it, or inventing suspicion to restore familiar intensity. Now, if you are becoming more conscious, you may begin recognizing that movement as it starts. You feel the old discomfort. You notice the impulse to create disturbance, and instead of acting immediately, you stay with the unease. This is where something very important happens. You discover that the discomfort peaks and passes. It is not permanent. It is not the truth of the relationship. It is an old response looking for its old environment. The same thing may happen in work. When a quiet period appears, instead of filling it with meaningless urgency, you may begin to tolerate the slower rhythm. At first, the mind complains. It says you are wasting time, missing something, becoming lazy, falling behind. But if you stay, another possibility begins to emerge. Perhaps your value was never meant to depend on perpetual strain. Perhaps clarity is possible without constant pressure. Perhaps meaningful action can arise from steadiness rather than tension. This is a radical shift for many people because it changes the emotional basis of motivation. You are no longer driven mainly by emergency, fear, overcompensation, or inner scarcity. You begin learning another mode of movement, one that comes from coherence. This movement is quieter, less dramatic. Sometimes it even feels less impressive from the outside, but inwardly it is far more sustainable. It does not require you to remain half-activated in order to feel alive. Jung would likely say that this is one sign of a more conscious relationship between the ego and the self. The ego no longer has to create endless agitation in order to maintain coherence. It can begin orienting around a deeper center, one that does not depend on crisis for legitimacy. That is why peace eventually stops feeling like a void and starts feeling like a context in which more truthful forms of life can appear. At first, you may have thought calm would make you dull, passive, or emotionally dead. But what often happens instead is something more subtle and more honest. You become less addicted to intensity, less impressed by urgency, less willing to confuse chaos with aliveness. In that space, your perceptions sharpen. You start noticing which relationships are stable rather than stimulating, which choices feel clean rather than dramatic, which forms of work ask something real of you without demanding the sacrifice of your nervous system. That is not a small achievement. It means peace is no longer merely the absence of tension. It becomes a ground from which discernment can grow. And once that happens, the old suspicion begins to lose authority, not because calm becomes exciting in the old way, but because it becomes trustworthy. You start to feel that nothing needs to go wrong in order for something real to be happening. You begin trusting stillness enough to let life unfold without constantly provoking it into movement. That is a profound form of maturity. It means you are no longer living as if stress were the only evidence of meaning. You are becoming capable of existing in a quieter truth, and that truth may not flatter the old identity. It may not give the ego the same dramatic sense of importance, but offers something much more valuable, a life that no longer has to wound you in order to feel familiar. That is what it means to begin staying inside the calm, not perfectly, not all at once, but enough that peace slowly stops feeling suspicious and starts becoming inhabitable. One of the strangest truths in psychological growth is that peace is not always welcome when it first arrives. You might spend years thinking calm is what you need. Less pressure, less conflict, less emotional noise, less inner strain. And yet, when life finally becomes quieter, something inside you does not immediately relax. It hesitates. It scans. It doubts. It waits for the disturbance that should be coming. That reaction can make you feel broken in a very private way. Because if peace is what everyone says they want, then why does it make you uncomfortable? Why does rest feel suspicious? Why does stillness make you restless? Why does calm feel less convincing than tension? Carl Jung would not treat those questions lightly. He would understand that what you are experiencing is not a failure character. It is the psyche revealing how deeply it is adapted to unrest. If your inner life has been organized for years around anticipation, coping, management, or emotional survival, then peace will not feel natural simply because it is healthy. It will feel unfamiliar. And what is unfamiliar often feels unsafe long before it feels healing. That is why this stage deserves compassion rather than self-judgment. You are not weak because calm unsettles you. You are seeing, perhaps for the first time, how much of your identity has been built around tension. How much of your energy has gone not only into surviving difficulty, but into becoming someone inside difficulty. The one who stays alert, the one who braces, the one who prepares, the one who holds things together, the one who remains psychologically organized through pressure. When that pressure begins to leave, the old identity loses part of its structure. Of course the transition feels strange. Of course your system asks questions. Of course some part of you wants to recreate the old atmosphere just to feel recognizable again. But recognition is not the same as truth, and familiarity is not the same as peace. That is one of the deepest lessons in this whole process. The familiar may still be chaos. The familiar may still be inner noise. The familiar may still be the constant emotional position of waiting for something to go wrong. But that does not mean those states are where your life becomes most real. Sometimes they are simply where your old self knew how to exist. And now something else is being asked of you. Not perfection, not instant transformation. Something quieter than that. The willingness to remain in a different atmosphere long enough for a different self to begin forming there. That is what makes peace so important. It does not only soothe you, it reveals you. It reveals what still rises in the absence of urgency. What emotions become audible when the noise decreases. What beliefs remain when productivity, vigilance, and reaction are no longer dominating the field. In that sense, peace is not passive. It is psychologically active. It shows you what tension used to conceal. And if you can stay with that revelation without immediately fleeing back into old familiar activation, then something profound begins to change. You no longer need unrest to feel coherent. You no longer need pressure to feel legitimate. You no longer need the old intensity in order to recognize yourself. That is the beginning of a much deeper freedom. Before we close, take a moment and ask yourself something honestly. When life gets quiet, what is the very first thing your mind starts searching for? A problem? A task? A future threat? An old wound to revisit? A reason to become tense again? Whatever appears first is not random. It tells you where your psyche still believes safety depends on activation. If this resonates, write in the comments one moment recently where nothing was wrong, but you still felt uneasy. What did your mind do with that quiet? And if you know someone who says they want peace but never seem able to trust it when it arrives, share this video with them. Because sometimes the hardest part is not surviving chaos. It is learning that you are allowed to exist when there is no chaos left to survive.